Good evening, my friends. I hope this message finds you in a moment of peace. Maybe you've just finished your evening meal. Maybe the television is off and the house has settled into that quiet hum that comes with nightfall. Wherever you are right now, I want you to take a breath with me, a deep one. Because tonight, we're going to talk about something the news will show you in black and white, but we're going to see in full color. Tonight, we're going back to Burkina Faso, back to that land of red earth and revolutionary fire, back to a place where a young man in military fatigue stood up and said the word the West fears most, no. And tonight, we're going to talk about what happens when you say no to people who've never heard that word before. Picture this scene with me. It's October in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. The name itself sounds like drums, Ouagadougou. Say it slowly. Feel the rhythm. This is a city that has seen empires rise and fall. French colonial officers once walked these streets like they owned them, and for a long time, they did. But not anymore. In a government building somewhere in that city, Security Minister Mahamadou Sana stood before cameras and microphones. The room was probably hot. It's always hot in October in the Sahel, but his voice was calm, measured. The kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from certainty. He announced that 8 people had been arrested. 8 workers from an organization called the International NGO Safety Organization, known by its acronym INSO, a humanitarian group they call themselves, based in The Hague, Netherlands, specializing in what they describe as humanitarian safety. Noble work, it sounds like? The kind of work that wins awards and grants and invitations to United Nations conferences. But Minister Sana used different words. He said spying. He said treason. He said collecting sensitive data without authorization. 8 people, a French man, a French Senegalese woman, a Czech man, a Malian, and 4 citizens of Burkina Faso itself. And just like that, the narrative war began. Now, before we go any further, let me tell you what the Western media wants you to think about this story. They want you to see military dictators arresting innocent aid workers. They want you to imagine brave Europeans trying to help poor Africans, only to be thrown in jail by paranoid soldiers who don't understand democracy. They want you to hear military government and think bad. They want you to hear humanitarian workers and think good. But tonight, we're going to ask a different question. A question that makes people uncomfortable. A question that gets you called a conspiracy theorist, or worse. What if the humanitarians weren't so humanitarian? Let me take you back a few months. To July, when this story really began. INSO had been operating in Burkina Faso for years. Doing their work, they said. Keeping humanitarians safe, they claimed. Collecting information about security situations, they explained. But in July, something changed. The Burkina Faso government suspended their operations for 3 months. The reason? They said INSO was collecting sensitive data without proper authorization. Now, INSO could have done what any legitimate organization would do. They could have paused their work. They could have cooperated with the investigation. They could have opened their books and proven their innocence. But according to Minister Sana, they didn't do that. They kept working in secret. Clandestinely, he said, covertly, they continued holding meetings, in person and online. They continued collecting information, sensitive security information, the minister claimed, information about military positions, about government operations, about things that, if they fell into the wrong hands, could get soldiers killed. And they didn't just collect it, they passed it on to foreign powers, Sana alleged. The country director, the person in charge of all of this, had already been arrested once when the suspension came into effect at the end of July. But still, the work continued. 8 people, all doing something in the shadows, all claiming innocence, all working for an organization headquartered thousands of miles away in Europe. From their office in The Hague, INSO issued a statement. They categorically rejected the allegations, they said. They remain committed to securing the safe release of their colleagues, they wrote. And then they said something interesting. They said the information they collect is not confidential and is largely already known to the public. Read that again. Let it sit with you for a moment. If the information is already known to the public, why do you need 8 people on the ground collecting it? If it's not confidential, why were you working in secret after being told to stop? If it's all innocent, why not simply cooperate with the investigation? These are the questions the Western media won't ask. But these are the questions that matter. Because here's what we know about NGOs in Africa. And this is going to make some people angry, but truth doesn't care about comfort. For decades, generations, Western organizations have come to Africa wearing the mask of humanitarianism. They come with grants and programs and smiling faces in their brochures. They talk about empowerment and development and partnership. But underneath, there's often another story. A story about intelligence gathering. A story about maintaining influence. A story about making sure that even after colonialism officially ended, the control never really did. You don't have to take my word for it. This is documented history. The CIA has used humanitarian cover for operations all over the world. European intelligence agencies have done the same. It's not conspiracy theory. It's declassified fact. And the pattern is always the same. Set up an organization that does real humanitarian work just enough to maintain credibility. Hire local staff who genuinely believe in the mission. And then, buried in all that legitimate work, collect intelligence, map the terrain, identify the players, build relationships with local officials, know who's who and what's where. And when a government gets too independent, too defiant, too unwilling to play the game, suddenly all that information becomes very valuable. Now, am I saying INSO is definitely a front for Western intelligence? No, I can't prove that. And that's not the point. The point is this. When a sovereign nation says, "We want to investigate your activities," the response should be cooperation, not defiance. When a government says, "Pause your work while we look into this," the response should be compliance, not continuing in secret. Unless, of course, you can't stop. Unless the work you're doing is more important than the laws of the country you're operating in. Unless you answer to someone other than the people you claim to be helping. Let's talk about context. Because nothing happens in a vacuum. Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, has done something revolutionary. They've said no to France. They've kicked out foreign military bases. They've told the old colonial powers that the days of being a puppet are over. And they're not alone. Mali and Niger have done the same thing. Together, they've formed something called the Alliance of Sahel States. 3 nations, all led by military governments, all refusing to bow to the West anymore. They've withdrawn from regional organizations that were controlled by France. They've shut down defense cooperation agreements that gave foreign troops free rein on African soil. Niger even nationalized a uranium mine that was being operated by a French nuclear company. Uranium, one of the most strategic resources on Earth. The fuel for nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And Niger, one of the poorest countries in the world, was watching France mine it out of their ground while their own people lived without electricity. So they took it back. And the West called it extremism. They called it authoritarianism. They called it a threat to stability. But here's what they didn't call it: sovereign decision-making. Because that's what this really is. These nations are making decisions for themselves, and the West, which has controlled Africa's resources and policies for over a century, cannot accept that. So what do? They don't send armies anymore. That's too obvious. That's too 20th century. Instead, they send NGOs. They send humanitarian organizations. They send people with clipboards and laptops who ask questions and take notes and build relationships. People who gather information. People who, when the time comes, can tell their governments exactly where the weak points are. This is modern colonialism. It doesn't wear a uniform. It wears a vest with a logo. It doesn't carry a rifle. It carries a smartphone. It doesn't conquer with force. It conquers with data. And Burkina Faso said, "Not here, not anymore." Now, let's be clear about something. There are real humanitarian workers doing real, life-saving work in Africa. People who've dedicated their lives to helping others. People who sleep in tents and eat rice and beans and work 18-hour days because they genuinely care. This isn't about them. This is about the structures that use that goodwill as cover. This is about the organizations that do 90% good work and 10% intelligence gathering, knowing the 90% will always protect the 10%. This is about power and control and the desperate need of declining empires to maintain their grip on a continent that's waking up. Within these three countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, there's a real fight happening. Armed groups linked to Al-Qaeda-controlled territory, they attack army posts. They terrorize civilians. People are dying. And human rights organizations, the same ones that suddenly care so much about arrested NGO workers, will tell you that both the terrorists and the military are committing atrocities. They'll tell you the military governments are brutal. They'll tell you Traore is a dictator. They'll tell you the alliance of Sahel states is dangerous. But they won't tell you why these groups exist in the first place. They won't tell you that these terrorist organizations became powerful during the years when French troops were supposedly keeping the region safe. They won't tell you that the chaos intensified precisely when these nations were most dependent on Western military aid. They won't tell you that maybe, just maybe, the instability serves a purpose. That chaos makes nations dependent. That fear makes people accept foreign intervention. That crisis is profitable for military contractors and intelligence agencies and all the industries that feed on Africa's suffering. Our ancestors had a saying, when you want to control a land, you don't need to conquer it. You just need to make sure it never has peace. And for too long, the Sahel has had no peace. But Traore and his fellow leaders are trying something different. They're saying, if the Western help isn't helping, maybe it's time to try something else. If the humanitarians are collecting intelligence, maybe it's time to investigate. If the NGOs answer to foreign governments instead of African people, maybe it's time to close the door. Is it risky? Yes. Is it messy? Absolutely. Will mistakes be made? Without question. But here's what I know. Sovereignty is never convenient. Freedom is never comfortable. And breaking chains always makes noise. The West wants you to believe that these military governments are the problem, that Traore is power-hungry, that arresting 8 NGO workers is proof of paranoia and tyranny. But ask yourself this. If your country was trying to break free from a century of exploitation, if every major Western power wanted you to fail, if intelligence agencies had a history of destabilizing governments that didn't comply, wouldn't you be suspicious of foreign organizations collecting security information? Wouldn't you investigate? Wouldn't you demand transparency? Wouldn't you protect your nation's interests, even if it made you look bad in newspapers printed thousands of miles away? The question isn't whether Burkina Faso is perfect. The question is whether Burkina Faso has the right to be sovereign. And tonight, as those 8 people sit in custody, as INSO demands their release, as the Western media writes outraged editorials, the real story isn't being told. The real story is that a young African leader looked at the old playbook and threw it in the fire. The real story is that 3 nations decided they'd rather be poor and free than prosperous and controlled. The real story is that the NGO empire, which has operated without accountability for decades, finally met a government willing to say, "Show me your receipts." And maybe they couldn't. So what does this mean for us? For those of us watching from far away, comfortable in our homes, far from the dust and heat and tension of Ouagadougou? It means we have to ask harder questions. It means we can't just accept the narrative we're given. It means when we hear humanitarian, we have to ask, who are they really serving? When we hear military government, we have to ask, what were they rebelling against? When we hear spying allegations, we have to ask, is it really so impossible? Because our own government has done this over and over. In Iran in 1953, in Guatemala in 1954, in Congo in 1961, in Chile in 1973, in Iraq, in Libya. The pattern is clear for anyone willing to see it. And if we can believe it happened there, why can't we believe it's happening now? I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm asking you to think, to question, to refuse to let others do your thinking for you. Because somewhere in Burkina Faso tonight, 8 people are in custody, and somewhere else, a young president is making decisions that will determine his nation's future. And somewhere beyond that, in offices in Paris and Washington and London, people are watching and calculating and planning their next move. This is the game. This is how power works in the 21st century. No invasions, no declarations of war, just humanitarians and development programs and partnerships until you step out of line. And then suddenly, you're a dictatorship. You're a threat. You're a problem that needs solving. But maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't Ibrahim Traoré. Maybe the problem is a system that can't imagine Africa making its own choices. Maybe the problem is an empire that would rather see chaos than independence. Maybe the real spies aren't the ones being arrested. Maybe they're the ones writing the news articles calling the arrests unjust. I'll leave you with that question tonight, not an answer. Because answers are easy. Questions make you think. So tonight, as you lay down to sleep in your freedom, remember that freedom is never given. It's always taken. And the ones taking it always get called criminals by the ones losing their grip. Remember the 8 people in custody, but also remember the millions trying to live free. Remember the headlines, but also remember what's not being said. Remember to question everything, especially the stories that make you feel righteous without making you think. Until we meet again, may peace find your home, may wisdom guide your heart, and may you never forget that truth is usually found in the places the cameras refuse to point. Good night, my friends. Somewhere in Burkina Faso, a revolution is still breathing. And somewhere in the West, an empire is learning that not every nation will bow forever. The soil remembers. And so should we.